Of all the guerrilla movements in Spanish America, the Colombian guerrilla movement is the only one that refuses to die. The FARC, the ELN, and the M-19 guerrilla groups from which even presidents of the Republic have emerged. They are the protagonists of an unprecedented story of power, violence, revolutionary intrigues, drug trafficking, and many more controversies. Don't miss with me the true story of the Colombian guerrillas. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches from the New Encyclopedia inviting you to support us by liking this video, leaving your comments, we always read them all, and hitting the bell for notifications. Of course, by subscribing to the channel and sharing it with all your friends on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else. Without further ado, let's get started with today's story. To understand why Colombia became fertile ground for modern guerrillas, we have to go back long before the first of them existed. Since its independence in 1810, Colombia has been a nation fractured by an ongoing struggle between two visions for the country, the liberal and the conservative. They weren't just political parties, they were entire group identities, divided by families, regions, beliefs, businesses, and much more. That struggle in the 19th century was never settled by votes. It led to 9 civil wars in Colombia, the last and most devastating being the so-called Thousand Days War, fought between 1899 and 1902 with an estimated death toll of 100,000. After that war, the conservatives consolidated a political hegemony in the country that lasted for 30 years, which in turn rested on a deeply hierarchical agrarian structure, with large tracts of land concentrated and managed by a few families, with a large peasant population that owned practically nothing and virtually had no access to the institutions and prerogatives protected by the state, while the so-called Colombian state had no real presence in vast regions throughout Colombia. Proof of this reality can be seen in 1928 in the banana plantations of Magdalena. The workers of the United Fruit Company go on strike, demanding decent working conditions. And the response of the conservative government of Colombia was to send the army, but at the request of the multinational company, the state repressed that protest. No one knows for sure how many died in what is known as the Banana Massacre. What is certain is that the denunciation of that massacre before the Colombian Congress launched the political career of a young lawyer from Bogota of humble origins, named Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who in the following years would become the most acclaimed popular leader Colombia had seen up to that point. By the second half of the 1940s, Gaitan was the preferred candidate of the Liberal Party. For the 1900 elections, Gaitan, and above all, represented a third way above the two parties and the traditional Colombian oligarchies. On April 9, 1948, around 1:05 in the afternoon, Gaitan left his office in the Agustin Nieto building at 7th Avenue and 14th Street in downtown Bogota. A man approaches him and shoots at point-blank range. Gaitan is hit by 3 bullets and dies minutes later. The assassin, Juan Roa Sierra, was lynched by the crowd before he could be interrogated, while the mastermind behind the assassination has never been identified. What followed this event became known in world history as the Bogotazo. Protests, riots, and disturbances reduced downtown Bogota to ashes and then spread throughout the entire country. Public buildings were set on fire, mayors were removed from office, and revolutionary councils were formed. It was also the beginning of what Colombians simply call, quote, la violencia, a period of violence that would last for more than a decade, leaving between 200,000 and 300,000 dead, directly caused by the conflict. In that breeding ground, liberal and communist peasants began to organize themselves into so-called self-defense guerrillas throughout the Colombian countryside. It's worth mentioning that guerrilla warfare, as a phenomenon and method of war, actually originated in Spain, dating back at least to the 18th century. Although related, it is not equivalent to the modern term guerrilla, which has been associated more with armed groups of socialist or leftist tendencies, among others, that have formed in Hispanic America. Returning from that aside, these self-defense guerrillas that formed in the countryside were not yet ideological or political guerrillas, as they would be understood later. They were communities that armed themselves fundamentally for defense, as the word suggests, because The state was not going to protect them from the various threats they could face, whether from their employers or from other political groups. But between 1953 and 1957, during the administration of General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, some of these self-defense groups ended up surrendering their weapons, and their numbers decreased considerably, in a process that, compared to the previous decade of violence, was advancing effectively, as part of General Rojas Pinilla's policy for pacifying the country. Even so, several of these groups would remain armed, disobeying the government, and just as tenacious as in the early years. By 1957, the so-called National Front, a pact between the parties and traditional Colombian elites, was formed to withdraw support from Rojas Pinilla and force him to resign. They agree to take turns holding the presidency of the republic, and when this resignation is carried out after Pinilla's resignation, a bipartisan system is established in Colombia. For this elite, with this new political pact, la violencia had ended and peace had come to Colombia. But with it also comes a political system, hermetically closed to any force outside of the two-party system. Confronted with claims that legal competition and voting were impossible in a system they said remained controlled by a small group. Different groups in Colombian politics begin to see guerrilla organization once again as a way to seize power. This was the context in which the already existing guerrilla groups, although few, stayed active, and other political groups in Colombia began reviving their activities through guerrilla organizing. So with the new status quo prevailing in Colombia, in the midst of the Cold War, and the Cuban Revolution of 1959 serving as the ideological beacon for the Hispanic American left, the emergence of guerrilla groups in several countries in the region, and the example of almost mythological figures like Che Guevara, the conditions were set for those so-called peasant self-defense groups from the Colombian countryside to start transforming into something different, into guerrilla organizations with a political program, a military structure, and an ambition for power. In the Tolima mountain range, in a remote village called Marquetalia, there lived a community of landless peasants, many of them former liberal guerrillas who did not surrender their weapons under Rojas Pinilla, and who organized themselves around leadership of a man named Pedro Antonio Marin, also nicknamed Tiro Fijo because of his great marksmanship with the rifle, and who was also known as Manuel Marulanda Velez, a war pseudonym he took from a Union leader who had been assassinated. Marquetalia was one of the so-called independent republics that had flourished in the most isolated and neglected areas of the Colombian countryside in the 1950s. Small communities of peasants, liberals, communists, and other marginalized people who had never integrated with the state. Conservative Senator Álvaro Gómez Hurtado had denounced these communities in Congress as threats to national order, and the government of then-President Guillermo León Valencia decided to take action. On May 27, 1964, the Colombian army launched the so-called Marquetalia operation, with thousands of soldiers and air support, against a group of just 48 fighters. Marulanda and his men resisted the attack and then slipped away into the mountains of Cauca. Far from destroying them, the bombing now turns them into a new political myth for the Colombian left. In July of that year, the first conference of the Southern Bloc is held, and in 1966, at its second conference. It is at this second conference that the group decides to call itself the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. The two official founders of the FARC are Marulanda, the liberal peasant who had taken up arms during the decade of violence, and, on the other hand, Luis Alberto Morantes, also known as Jacobo Arenas, the communist ideologue who connected the guerrilla group ideologically and logistically with the Colombian Communist Party. It was at that time that many of their members traveled to the Soviet Union to receive training in guerrilla warfare and Marxist-Leninist doctrine. But while Marulanda remained in a defensive position in Tolima, 600 kilometers to the north, in the mountains of Santander, another group was taking up arms, with a radically different origin. They didn't come from the countryside, they came from the university classrooms of Bogotá and from Havana, where Fidel Castro's regime had trained and financed them. as part of a plan, that of the political expansion of Cuban Castroism. Fabio Vázquez Castaño, originally from Calarcá, in Quindío, son of a father who was murdered during the period of violence in Colombia, had traveled to Cuba on a scholarship and had returned convinced that Colombia needed its own socialist, Castroist, Guevarist revolution. With that drive, on July 4, 1964, the National Liberation Army was founded, also known as the ELN, with just 16 men in the village of La Fortuna, in the municipality of San Vicente de Chucurí, Santander. 6 months later, on January 7, 1965, the ELN, it becomes known with the takeover of the town of Simicota, an armed takeover of the town, where they spread the so-called Simicota Manifesto, a call to Colombians for revolutionary struggle. In that document, they signed with the slogan, "Not one step back, liberation or death." The ELN then has a trait that distinguishes it from all other Latin American guerrillas, the influence of the so-called liberation theology. That current of Catholicism, which deserves an entire documentary, sought to link Christian doctrine with Marxist, socialist, and other kinds of ideologies. In 1965, the Colombian priest Camilo Torres joined the ELN. He would die in combat just 4 months later, immediately becoming a sort of martyr for the ELN. But if the FARC are children of the countryside and the ELN of the universities, the M-19 will be a child of the city and of political activism in a moment of great indignation. The M-19 was born as a direct response to what many Colombians considered to be a scandalous electoral fraud. The presidential elections of April 19, 1970, in which General and former President Gustavo Rojas Perez, with his party National Popular Alliance, known as ANAPO, seemed to be winning, according to the radio broadcast that afternoon, until midnight, when the Ministry of Government suspended the count, and the next day, contrary to the previous day's trend, the conservative candidate, Misael Pastrana Borrero, appeared as the winner. As a result of this alleged fraud, days of protests and instability would follow, then a return to normalcy, and the beginning of Misael Pastrana's presidential term. It wouldn't be until 4 years later, and after the disappearance of General Rojas Pinilla as a political figure, that the 19th of April movement would be born operationally, taking its name precisely from the date of the fraud against Rojas Pinilla. Within the ranks of the ANAPO party, which was originally defined as a nationalist and third-way party, there were factions of various tendencies, right-wing, left-wing, and others. It was the left-wing faction that kept gaining more and more ground. And where are the founders of the M-19 going to come from? Among them, Jaime Bateman, Cayón, Luis Oteros, and Fuentes, and a young 17-year-old activist named Gustavo Petro. At its founding, they would bet on an urban, symbolic, and media-focused guerrilla, very different from the style of the FARC and the ELN, who by that time were already carrying out major armed activities throughout Colombia. And we will go deeper into this in the video. So, by the mid-1970s and late 1980s, the 3 major guerrilla groups had already been formed. Not only the most famous in Colombia, but perhaps in all of Spanish America. And they would cause a stir, controversy, and bloodshed in Colombian history. Now, looking to fully begin their guerrilla activities, the 3 guerrilla groups had to seek funding, and their sources would become one of the darkest chapters of the Colombian conflict. Kidnapping would become the first guerrilla industry in Colombia. Businessmen, cattle ranchers, politicians, journalists, and even tourists would be turned into bargaining chips by the guerrilla. Particularly the FARC, according to international organizations, would become the largest kidnapping group on the planet, with a total of 21,396 kidnappings attributed to this organization. But it would later be drug trafficking that would transform the very nature of the conflict. Although the drug trafficking business had already started in Colombia between the 60s and 70s, both by the initiative of Colombians and American agents, in its more political and ideological beginnings, the guerrilla had rejected this practice. Whereas kidnapping was somehow justified under the class struggle and wealth, that was acquired illegitimately. However, by the 1980s, in the territories mostly controlled by the FARC, and to a lesser extent by the ELN, coca and cannabis crops began to proliferate. The guerrilla leaders saw how profitable this business was, which at first started by approaching or extorting drug traffickers with the so-called grammage tax. But soon, they would end up becoming the actual owners of the operation, both of a large production network and of the distribution of coca derivatives all over the world. As a result of the conflicts and wars within the realm of drug trafficking, on the FARC side, almost 97,000 direct deaths are attributed to them, and more than 17,000 to the ELN, in addition to territorial disputes, clashes, and the proliferation of minefields throughout Colombia. These wars have also brought about the displacement and death of innocent civilians in the conflict, the forced recruitment of children and adolescents, and the emergence of what is called the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or, in simpler terms, the phenomenon of the paramilitaries, which deserves a separate video. For its part, although the M-19 did not have a direct relationship with the drug business, it would not be free from controversy. Being helped by the Soviet Union and trained by the Tupamaro guerrilla group from Uruguay, led by the future president Pepe Mujica. In its beginnings, the M-19 would be characterized by, open quotes, acts of symbolic impact such as the theft of Simón Bolívar's sword at the Quinta de Bolívar in Bogotá in January 1974, with the message, open quotes, Bolívar, your sword returns to the fight. They also committed the theft of more than 5,000 weapons from the Colombian Army's North Canton through a tunnel in 1978, an operation in which President Gustavo Petro had direct involvement. And they also carried out the takeover of the Embassy of the Dominican Republic in 1980, where they kidnapped 16 ambassadors, including the ambassador of the United States. Then, towards the 1980s, the M-19 continued to be relevant. In events such as the kidnapping of Marta Ochoa, a member of the famous Ochoa brothers family, partners of the Medellin cartel, and the kidnapping of Camilla Michelson, daughter of banker Jaime Michelson, and urban agitation activities in universities and municipalities, which often ended in violent situations because of the M-19, and among them, Gustavo Petro. They not only used to handle and store large amounts of weapons, but also used the poor neighborhoods of the cities as strongholds to protect themselves from police raids. Because of this, many humble and innocent Colombians were caught in crossfire and killed during those raids. Like in the Bolívar 83 neighborhood in the municipality of Zipaquirá, founded by Petro himself, where the M-19 operated. It's worth mentioning that figures like Pablo Escobar repeatedly expressed their admiration for the M-19 and their agreement on issues such as the rejection of the extradition of Colombians. Another controversial fact about the M-19 is that Iván Mario Ospina, the supreme commander of the M-19, was given refuge directly by Pablo Escobar, along with financial support. In fact, various accounts attribute the events of the Palace of Justice siege to that alliance between Escobar and the M-19. That would become the most notorious and violent act of the M-19, and it is believed that the guerrillas received $2 million from Escobar to carry it out. On November 6, 1985-35, M-19 guerrillas took over the building. The Palace of Justice in Bogotá, home to the Supreme Court, was used as the reason to put the president of Colombia on trial. Betancourt, for failing to comply with the terms of a recently signed ceasefire between the government and the guerrillas, the Colombian army responds with force. One of the days that Colombia will never forget, with the use of weapons and explosives of all kinds, in the midst of uncertainty and a power vacuum. And the fires that destroyed the building left nearly 100 people dead, including civilians, guerrillas, soldiers, and police officers. They were traumatic, difficult days for Colombia's Republican imagination, revisiting this story and the history of the guerrillas, the FARC, and part of the ELN. In 1985, they signed a peace agreement with the government of Belisario Betancourt that included the creation of a political party so that the guerrillas could participate in politics legally and institutionally. This party would be called the Patriotic Union. However, during the following years, approximately 5,000 members of the left, including leaders, candidates, council members, deputies, and supporters of the Patriotic Union, they would be killed by drug traffickers, paramilitaries, and state agents. Among them was Manuel Cepeda Vargas, who is the father of the current presidential candidate, Ivan Cepeda. And in response to this, the FARC and the ELN would abandon the peace process and intensify the armed conflict in Colombia. However, shortly after, in 1990, after intense negotiations, the M-19 would become the first Hispanic-American guerrilla group to demobilize after signing the peace agreement with the M-19. And what about other minor armed groups? Even so, weeks after handing over their weapons, the top leader and presidential candidate of the M-19, Carlos Pizarro Leon Gomez, is assassinated. And despite this traumatic event, the M-19 organization maintains its commitment to lay down its arms in exchange for the amnesty it had been granted. And they go on to become the political party Democratic Alliance M-19 with significant urban popular support. This new political force will achieve historic representation in the National Constituent Assembly of 1991, where Antonio Navarro Wolf will be the co-president of the drafting of the new political constitution of Colombia.
Yeah.
Entering the 21st century, although the M-19 had demobilized, the FARC and the ELN were more active than ever. The first decade of the 21st century was the toughest militarily for the guerrillas, especially for the FARC. The two presidential terms of Álvaro Uribe will be defined by his policy of democratic security, a military offensive against the FARC, supported by intelligence from the United States, Israel, and England, which would result in multiple blows to the guerrilla leadership. Secretariat leaders like Raúl Reyes, Mono Jojoy, and Iván Rios would be killed, and the number of combatants would drop from almost 20,000 to less than 8,000. Weakened militarily but not defeated, the FARC would agree in 2012 to sit down and negotiate with the government of President Juan Manuel Santos, a negotiation that takes place in Havana. 4 years of negotiations would culminate on September 26, 2016, with the signing of the so-called peace agreement in Cartagena, in front of leaders from all over the world. However, in the referendum held on October 2, the Colombian people reject the agreement, considering it more of an agreement of impunity. After the agreement was modified and ratified by Congress, it would come into effect on June 27, 2017, and the FARC would formally hand over their weapons to the United Nations. But this new peace has been fragile from the beginning. For its part, the Colombian government failed to fulfill some fundamental commitments, such as crop substitution and security guarantees for former combatants. And the agrarian reform, which was at the heart of the agreement, at least 500 civil leaders or former FARC combatants were killed between the signing of the agreement and the year 2019. The result will be, as in 1985, an inevitable fracture. A faction of the 6 former FARC commanders, led by Ivan Marquez, one of the chief negotiators in Havana, announced in 2019 their return to armed struggle and founded the so-called Second Marquetalia. This new group has operated up to the present mainly in border areas with Venezuela, territory where it is reported that until 2026, it acted with the tacit approval and funding of the Venezuelan government. At the same time, the so-called Central General Staff, a group of FARC dissidents who did not accept the peace agreement, operates with about 2,000 fighters in coca-growing territories in the south of the country. The ELN, for its part, has never signed a peace agreement and remains engaged in armed struggle to this day. Not only that, but it is currently the oldest active guerrilla group on the planet. On the other hand, a former guerrilla, Gustavo Petro, a former member of the M-19, becomes president of Colombia, with a policy called Total Peace, which seeks to negotiate simultaneously with the ELN, the Second Marquetalia, the Central General Staff of the FARC, and other armed groups. Today, in 2026, the dialogues have made progress but mostly regressed according to their own officials, without reaching definitive results and casting doubt on the future of the armed conflict in Colombia. In the year 2026, it is recorded that Colombia still has the same number of members in irregular, armed groups as it did in 2011, right when the peace process with the FARC was beginning, but with a crucial difference. The conflict has changed a lot compared to how it was before. Today, it is a much more fragmented, diversified, armed ecosystem, adapted to the irregular economies that sustain it, where the logic is much less ideological and political, and more about territorial control and business. These are the groups that control parts of coca-growing regions, illegal mining, and strategic corridors. The year 2025, according to some international organizations, has been one of the worst in humanitarian terms in the last decade, and the 2026 electoral period was overshadowed by the murder of Congressman and presidential pre-candidate Miguel Uribe Turbay. Armed groups have continued to grow during Petro's government, taking advantage of the supposed negotiations to strengthen their power. In the regions with the highest presence of illicit crops, the conflict that will be inherited is now a more dispersed conflict and therefore more difficult to negotiate than the scenario that existed a few decades ago. A conflict that, without a doubt, has as its main victim the Colombian population. To the more than 1 million Colombians killed directly by this war and the 10.2 million displaced in the long and bloody history of the Colombian armed conflict. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that you give us great support by leaving your comments, liking, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.